Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Archives of American Art's Unboxed Lunch. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this is being recorded. My name is Nora, and we're thrilled you're joining us for lunch, which I am enjoying here in the Archives Washington, D.C. headquarters in the Victor Building. The Archives National Collector, Josh T Franco, is just down the hall in his office. First, I'd like to thank everyone for a wonderful year of Unboxed Lunches. I am taking up an opportunity at another institution and handing over the reins to my brilliant colleague, Jenny Williams, after this installment. There's Jenny.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Nora, for hosting an amazing year of Unboxed Lunches. We look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thanks, Jenny. Today's event is all about the papers of silverpoint artist Susan Schwalb, which Josh will be exploring with all of you in just a few minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At any time during the webinar, you can submit your questions for Josh, which I will read to him as he uncovers items from the collection. Take this off now. To submit a question, just type it into the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel on your screen. Today, we are lucky to have the artist in attendance. So Susan, please chime in where you'd like through the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Closed captioning is available. You can access captions through the CC button on the right side of the control panel at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce National Collector at the Archives of American Art, Josh T Franco. Hi, Josh.
Hello. I didn't mean to have that coy face on when I came on. I don't know what that was about. It's been a long week. Hi, Nora.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Nora, sad to see you go. Look forward to continuing Unboxed in the new year with Jenny. We're here today to talk about Susan Schwalb. And just to give you a little background, not only on Susan, but how these papers came to the archives. Like everything now, the pandemic is a factor. So Unboxed is always about new collections, of course, and this is a new collection institutionally. Physically, the papers were sitting in our safe, secure storage for a while because I visited, the process began typically. Susan was in touch, had been thinking about where her papers would go. The archives was an option. I was happy to go up to her home in Boston with her beloved husband, Marty Boykin, their home together there, as they were preparing to sell that house after living there for quite a while and move back to New York. We're often called when people are moving, which makes a lot of sense. You're thinking about what to do with the stuff at that point. So I went and spent a few hours with Susan in her home, with her and her assistant upstairs, and did what I typically do in that situation. Susan said, here's the room with the file cabinets and the closet with all the potential stuff. I spent a few hours there with Susan also there, just going through and identifying what was appropriate for the archives. We then set that aside in a cleared out area we had designated in Susan's studio across the hall. And then I left Susan to give it a last look, make sure she was felt good about sending it all to DC to become part of the archives. And that's where that was for then. And then a few weeks later, she was ready. Her and her assistant packed everything up, and our registrar, Susan Carey, oversaw the shipping process from there. And then the papers came. So the papers came, they went down into storage, waiting for me to get to them and rebox them. And then the pandemic hit. So they were there for a while before we could start returning to the office physically. I had a number of collections down there to get through, and I thank Susan for her patience as I did. But then once I was able to get back in the office and spend time, I picked up right where we left off, reboxed the papers, wrote the deed of gift. We got it signed in just the last few weeks, and here we are. So I'm really happy to get into them. As Nora noted, and as many of you know, Susan Schwalb is I've been watching videos with you, Susan, this morning on YouTube. There's a lot of great ones out there, FYI. And I know you said some people call you the Queen of Silverpoint. And I think that's warranted as a title. And so, it's an interesting introduction to a medium for me. It's a a medium with a long track record in American art. So it's great to have this collection here. And why she's called the Queen of Silverpoint is not only because her own skills with the medium, but because of her long, dedicated efforts to bringing the history of the medium together, as well as the technical, basically the technical instruction manual that was published by Routledge in 2019. In one of the videos I was watching this morning, Susan said, you can't have a career without knowing in art, without knowing other people. And her papers really bear that out. So let's get into them. We'll start with Silverpoint, and then I want to show you some interesting things. And I see a hi from Fanny Sanin, whose oral history we have. Hola, Fanny. It's so nice to have you here. So let's start with Silverpoint, what Susan's known for. Archives are always full of surprises, of course, and we'll get to those. This nice little label in Susan's hand, or maybe her assistant, Silverpoint Book Part 1. So the book, is published, but the book was a lot of network building and a lot of activating and researching of who was involved in this medium throughout the country and I think the world. So if you look in this folder, all of these folders have individual people's names as the title. And again, this is a raw collection. It will be processed by our processing archivists in the next couple of years. And this is actually a really well organized one, but it'll look even cleaner at the end of that process. So I'm just going to pick one and pull it out and see what we have. This is a folder labeled Michiko Itatani or Statatani. I can't read the handwriting too clearly. Susan, if you want to drop in any memories of communicating with Michiko Itani, that would be great. So all of this is, I think I can safely assume, are basically research files for the book. There's basic things like a CV. Research files are just really, these kind of project files are amazing because they show you a whole world rather than just one artist practice, although that's always great too. So here's a handwritten letter. Let me show you some handwriting. And I'll just read a little bit. Dear Susan, I'm sorry I couldn't write you sooner. I was out of town again and just came back. I'll be going to NYC after tomorrow. This is one of the rare times I am in and out. It's too bad I'll be in Japan when you will be here. Otherwise, you can stay in my place, though it is very basic. You can save money. Artists always need to save money. You basically camp out in my place. I checked several places. There are a few I thought that were okay. And then there's a list of hotels, the YMCA in Chicago. And this is just a great example of artists supporting each other with very practical life matters like where to stay. And Susan says she's a wonderful artist based in Chicago.
That's what I was going to communicate. Yeah. Thanks, Susan.
And then, and this is great too. So there's some flyers. Michiko Itani, I see the name clearly now. We love anything with dates, and especially with the year following the month and the dates, and a location and an address. This is research gold for us. So any researcher can sort of reconstruct the history of this artist's exhibitions through. And then let's look at one more. Here's some photographs. We love an installation photograph. As I'm sure you all know, most art exhibitions, and 99 out of 100 times, are temporary, up for a span of a few months. So documentation of how art was hung and installed is incredibly valuable, especially when it's labeled. So I know that's a little blurry, but come to our reading room and you can take a closer look. Okay, that's great. So I could get lost just in this one folder, but there are dozens and dozens here. So I'm just going to keep going. One more Silverpoint artist. Let's see, here's Leo D.
Susan just added that she hasn't done Silverpoint in a while, the artist we were that you were just speaking about.
Oh, and then I see you're recommending Janet Culbertson. Let me see. I think this box is the second half of the alphabet. And I'll say, so I have 4 boxes out here. Susan, your papers are about 19 boxes and I left the rest downstairs. I think the first half of the alphabet is there. But as I'm skipping through, I see John Wilde. So John Wilde has a strong presence in the archives already, and we love finding those kinds of connections. Not that, this collection has many points in its favor as to why the archives are the appropriate home, but John Wilde is a really fun name to see. A past Unboxed Lunch was dedicated to the papers of Dudley Huppler, who was very much in John Wilde's world. They were good friends and collaborators. So this is interesting. Here's an example of Wilde's sort of magical realist art. He was based in the Midwest. Yeah, Susan, this is a nice connection to see. This is a folder that, so Unboxed really are unplanned, y'all. Like, I'm just pulling folders here in real time as I would if I were here alone at my desk, just getting to know the collection. And I think this must be, yeah, silverpoint on prepared paper. So I never thought of Wilde as a silverpoint artist, but here we are with the great clear example of one of his silverpoint drawings, and in a context of a collection where we can see him in a whole new way. And I like the cover of this little fold out too, it's very nice. That's nice. I'm having a brain tingle moment here because I'm discovering this in real time. I've gotten to know Wilde's practice pretty well over the last 3 or 4 years. Let's switch gears to photographs. A 6-foot panel in silverpoint sounds like so much meticulous work, Susan. Thank you for that fact.
Susan, how long do you think that 6-foot panel in silverpoint might have taken?
Yeah, how many hours is that?
I would like to know.
Yeah. Think about that while I look through these photographs. So this is old school photographs. We do have to, Susan and I have a plan to think about her digital material too in the future now that the papers are all done. So there's a couple of dozen of these, where you pick up from the developer back in the day. It's labeled, which is so nice. Thank you so much. August 2006, New Bedford, Massachusetts, October 3rd opening at Salon State and installment shoots. Let's go through here. This is great. Some installations. I think this is all Susan's work here. Here's somebody looking, student maybe.
So Susan did say, doesn't know how long the panel might have taken, but everyone thinks that metal point takes a long time, but it doesn't always, she said. And she said that's at Salem State. So I think it was a student.
I think we should do like a metal point workshop or something one day in the conference room. I think it'd be fun. And it's also research our collections for other, apparently, John Wilde, I imagine I'm gonna go back to his papers with this in mind. It might show us new things. Here's Susan herself in a picture, which it's always great to have a person in one of these photos because it gives you a sense of the scale of the works. And then when it's the artists themselves, that's a little extra special. This is great. So, not only art historians come to us to research, but curators, art handlers, maybe not so many art handlers, but we're a great resource if you're out there and thinking about it. But you can see the lighting here, which is interesting. So you see the tracks, you see how they're arranged. Susan, I don't know, did you like the lighting in this show? Were you happy with it? Would you have done anything different? I'm going to do one more. Okay, so Susan, you did not install the show yourself at Salem. So this one is labeled SF, I assume San Francisco, April 2002, and El Paso show. So as a Texan, I'm very happy to see something in El Paso. And just further to the point of installation shots and what they teach us, here's, this is clearly not a white cube gallery. It's some kind of architecture. Maybe this building wasn't intended as an art gallery. You have this arch, but the really interesting off-center installation of that work. So, whoever installed this did not ignore the arch, and they actually did something pretty interesting by not centering the work there as well. I'm glad you had a good time in El Paso, Susan. Oh, and here's some work sat on top of plinths, it looks like, rather than on the wall. And one more from here, an event around the exhibition, it looks like a setup for. Yeah, so these are, you can almost reconstruct the full experience of, this opening and this show. Oh, this is interesting. So here's a photograph of a pianist on stage. It looks, there's no audience, so it looks like maybe a rehearsal or something. And I will note that, like I said earlier, Susan was married to the great musician, composer, Martin Boykan, whose papers are housed at the Library of Congress just down the street. And that was an interesting exchange about the papers and correspondence, which, as you probably know, correspondence is a huge portion of our collections at the archives. We had a discussion. Every collection's a little different in the decisions you make. So we had a discussion about the correspondence that Boykan had sent to Susan over the years. And they initially had come in that first installment to the archives. Then, Susan thought about it during pandemic time when we had time to think about a lot of things. Thought they might be better at eventually going to the Library of Congress. It's really convenient that they were just down the street from each other. So if somebody wanted to go see those, they just have to go down the street to see them. So we made the decision to pull those out before the deed was signed on these papers. And eventually they'll go to Boykan's papers at the LOC. So it's an interesting archival relationship there, and a relationship between a musician and a visual artist, which I'm really curious about. I read some of those letters before sending them back to Susan, and I think what a great relationship. I think we should all aspire to a marriage like that. And then something else that we have much of in the archives, and we're so glad to add, Susan's here, are sketchbooks. So here's a rather large one. And I don't think there are many examples of actual silverpoint, because in the papers, those are artworks after all, and that's not what we collect. But silverpoint is clearly all about line and an artist's skill with creating lines, with drawing lines on challenging surfaces and with really interesting materials. So it's great to see Susan developing line. I'm trying to be really careful with this. Let's see. Oh, there we go. It's going to be upside down. But here's a figure. That's also nice too, because Susan, most of your work that's out in the world does not have figures in it. So having these sketchbooks and seeing your skill with drawing figures is really nice. But I've looked through these.
I'm sorry. Someone asked if we have any other silverpoint artists in our collection besides the artist you.
So that's a good question, and that's it's interesting to think about John Wilde, and I think that's a question that a researcher is now empowered to find out for themselves, because these papers. So I'm going to consider these, always, like, if somebody asked me about silverpoint in the archives, this is what we would call an anchor collection in that area. So we have those kinds of collections that are not only about a single person, but about a field. For instance, the Tomasi Bar Fausto research materials are on Chicano art. We have the papers of many Chicano artists, but when I think about what's the anchor collection for those, I think of, Tomas's papers. So that'll be the same with Susan's going forward, as this is our anchor collection of silverpoint. And I see Susan says, looks like student work from CMU, Carnegie Mellon University. Oh, and I see Paula Gerard is in our collection too. Y'all, we have like over 6,000 collections. I don't have the full list memorized, so I love being told what we have, and that being a surprise to me is just fine. And you can always just keyword search silverpoint and metalpoint on our website, aaa.si.edu, and see what comes up. There's another interesting, apparently from student times, sort of like, I don't know, would this have been the 70s? So around the idea of like eccentric abstraction and sort of like abstraction with no hard edges. Oh, and then This is my favorite because every artist has to go through drawing hands and learning how to do that. So here's our Susan Schwalb example of learning hands. The hardest thing to do. Late 1960s. Thanks, Susan. We pull out one more. So here's a smaller notebook, a little easier to handle. And this is another thing too. I've run into a few pages like this with just some writings, somewhat poetic. This one's clearly addressed to someone. Yeah, that's the power of the archives, is you really learn about people's relationships, their sort of inner world. I think everyone makes attempts at poetry. I know my notebooks have those things too. So it's really an honor when an artist trusts their papers to us, because they're trusting us with quite a bit. Here's more figure. I think this might be watercolor, maybe in ink. Exposed but safe, Susan. I'm really grateful.
You're in very good company.
You're in very good company. Okay, then I'll get one more box here. Let's see. See what these binders are. So just to give you some technical insight, this is how Susan had these documents organized. When our processing archivists go through, they will keep the order that's here for the most part, but go through and get rid of the plastic sleeves, which decay really, you probably have aging plastic sleeves around, and you know how they age in yellow, which is not great for paper, and metal as well is really unhealthy for paper. So this binder will be discarded because it also does not have any, the label will be maintained. So there is a label and we never get rid of information. This is Works 2008. But these will all be put in acid-free folders and labeled, the label will be kept intact. Oh, and this is the business of art. So these are documenting sales, correspondence with galleries. This one in Nantucket, Massachusetts. Price lists are here. And then there are slides. So this is like what you would send or receive in the process of making a deal, selling art. Yeah. And it's interesting to just see all the organizations and galleries and museums that you might never have heard of, but this, Susan, your work is all over the world. It's amazing. So here's one in France, Galerie Marlot, the Art Connection in Boston, the MFA in Boston. Amazing. There's also, not in this binder I'm seeing, but I've seen confirmations of donations. So when artists donate works to sale, benefit sales and things like that. Yeah. So this binder will be discarded, keeping the label, and our processing archivist will put everything beautifully in folders, interleaving with acid-free paper where necessary. Yeah.
So Josh, we have a question here about, you mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, but when Susan's papers were at the archives, so it was during COVID happened and, we didn't come into the office for some time. What were her papers doing? Like, where were they stored? And then, what did that look like?
So they were in the same physical space that accessioned, completed collections are in, but there's a back room that's separate from the permanent shelving that's kind of secure storage where we put collections as soon as they arrive and when they await reboxing and deeding, which is the first step after they arrive, which I do before handing the whole collection over to the archivist. So they were, next to all the other permanent collections in that storage area. It's climate controlled, secure, all that kind of thing. This is the notebook I was looking for. I found out, first of all, these beautiful butterflies, I think like decoupaged on the cover or something. But this is a notebook where we start to see, the iconic Susan Schwalb visual language sort of come into play. And this is, I think, graphite pencil. But these lines will look very similar. If you've looked at Susan's work, you'll see the line work and the shading. Susan, you also did a lot of experimenting with burning paper early in your career. And I haven't found any burned paper yet, but that's not to say it isn't here. And I wonder if you sent us any. I think those are really beautiful works. Oh, so here's some like just really stellar. I think it translates pretty well through the camera, but if you were here in person, some really fine line work here. And it's dated, which is great. So this is April 5th, 1979. Yeah, this just continues. It's kind of a series within the notebook. Okay, so Susan has some burned sketchbook work that is not here yet. And that's great. Yeah, Sarah, our great colleague at the archives, you're lucky because you can come down the hall and see them after this. It's really, really beautiful. Yeah, I don't even know how one creates this texture here, particularly. Smoke. Okay, so not burned, but these are smoke. Amazing. The idea of smoke near our papers probably makes a lot of my colleagues nervous, but of course this was done a long time ago and we will never try to reproduce that here. It's amazing. Oh, look. Okay, so take this in. That's a beautiful little moment. So we do have one burned. It's great. And then the back cover. And Susan, it looks like this really beautiful butterfly notebook was a gift from my dear friend Susan in celebration of a warm and wonderful event made by Justine Dante or Wanty or Wentz maybe, in the some season of 1978. Susan is laughing. So Susan, I don't know, it's Justine is the first name. I think the last name is Wentz or Wantz, a Chicago artist, great. We love when artists give other guests. Oh, I mean, Susan, the labeling you've done is just, thank you so much. The researchers will thank you hundreds of years down the road. So I'll read this to you. We see this writing at the top in the back cover. So sketchbook number 13, 1978 to 1980. Amazing.
I think that is a perfect way to leave it. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, and I'm sure that wasn't enough for everybody. So come see the papers.
Thank you, Susan. Those the burnt pieces were especially delightful. I don't think we've had anything like that. We've been able to show anything like that on Unboxed Lunch yet. So thanks, Josh. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to my colleagues, Eric Corby, Sarah Bohannon, and Jenny Williams, who have been support to Unboxed Lunch since its genesis last December. So thank you for that. I hope everyone's enjoyed Unboxed Lunch as much as I have been had a great time putting it on and keeping touch with our audience. So support from friends like you makes programming like Unboxed Lunch possible. We hope you'll consider making a gift to the archives this holiday season. To donate, you can visit aaa.si.edu/support. Your support goes towards collecting, preserving, and sharing the legacy of American art with friends around the world. So thank you so much for joining us. We wish you a happy holidays from the archives, and we will see you in 2022. Thanks. Bye.